Hello there and welcome back. My name is Shevlin, and today we're going to be diving into where Paul's story with Christ really begins. So we've talked about kind of his marks of a disciple and how he lived that out. We've talked about his overall story, who he was. And so really today we're looking at where does his life in Christ begin? And even though he's got this dramatic conversion story, there's some very practical things we can pull out of this 9th chapter of Acts for our own lives as well. So as we start in Acts chapter 9, if we look at the first couple verses, meanwhile, Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. He went to the high priest and asked them for letters to the synagogues in Damascus, so that if he found any there who belonged to the way, whether men or women, he might take them as prisoners to Jerusalem. So as Paul enters the story here, whose name was Saul at this point, he's the bad guy. But if we really look at Paul's story, he loved God. So our first point is that our passion for God can be what Paul calls himself misdirected. But Paul loved God. In Galatians 1:13 and 14 it says, "For you have heard of my previous way of life in Judaism, how intensely I persecuted the church of God and tried to destroy it. I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people and was extremely zealous for the traditions of my fathers." It's not that Paul was against God, but his passions were misdirected. He did not yet know Jesus or understand that Jesus was God's son. And so he thought he was doing the right thing by pursuing these believers and defending God's honor, but he was misdirected. He says this himself in Romans 10. "Dear brothers and sisters, the longing of my heart and my prayer to God is for the people of Israel to be saved. I know what enthusiasm they have for God, but it is misdirected zeal. For they don't understand God's way of making people right with himself. Refusing to accept God's way, they cling to their own way of getting right with God by trying to keep the law." Sometimes we can be blinded by our own passions. We might have a particular cause or something that is so dear to our hearts, and we think everyone else should believe the way that we do. We push our agendas and our beliefs and our causes when sometimes those aren't central gospel issues. Yes, we should fight for and defend the gospel and explain it to people whenever possible. But so many of the issues that we fight about or push our agenda about aren't central gospel issues. And so we have this passion that we're pushing, and it can be misdirected. Sometimes it can even throw people off of wanting to know the Lord, depending on how we're communicating those misdirected passions. Not that there's anything wrong with having passions and causes that are near to our hearts, and we should share those with people. That's natural. But when we're pushing it as an agenda and as the only way or the only truth, then we run into a problem. One thing we say around Emmanuel a lot is that we don't major in the minors. If it's not central to a gospel issue, we're not going to make a big deal out of things that are smaller discrepancies or smaller issues among believers or among friends. So this kind of leads us to number 2, that when we persecute believers, we persecute Jesus himself. In Acts 9:5, after this voice comes down, and in verse 4, he says, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" "Who are you, Lord?" Saul asked. "I am Jesus whom you are persecuting," he replied. Now Saul was persecuting believers, but Jesus says, when you persecute my people, you persecute me. Now I know persecute is kind of a strong word, but it means to pursue with harassing or oppressive treatment, to annoy or trouble persistently. Again, we can harass other people with our own agenda. We can simply even treat other believers unkindly, unfairly, unjustly. We can hold unforgiveness in our hearts or resentment, or we can just reject people. If we are treating God's people in those ways, we are treating Jesus himself that way. So we need to be very cautious about how we treat God's people. It's almost like a reversal of what Jesus says is, whatever you do to the least of these, you do unto me. In that verse, he's talking about being kind and giving bread and giving clothing and giving shelter. And he's saying, if you do that for someone else, it's like you're doing it for me. Well, here we see that Jesus says, if you're mistreating people, you are mistreating me. The other part of that we can actually take comfort in is how near Jesus is to us in persecution. Sometimes we're so afraid of hard things happening or being persecuted for our faith, being rejected because of what we believe in. But it helps us to know that Jesus is right there in it with us, that Jesus takes it that personally, that if we are being harmed, then so is he. And so we can take comfort in that, knowing it's that personal to him, and it can give us courage to carry on because Jesus is in it with us. The third thing is here's where we get to the part of the story where we hit Ananias. So in Acts 9 verses 13 and 14, the Lord has come to him in verse 11 and 12, and he's telling him to go to Saul and restore his sight. In verse 13, Lord Ananias answered, I have heard many reports about this man and all the harm he has done to your saints in Jerusalem. And he has come here with authority from the chief priest to arrest all who call on your name. So point number 3 is we must be willing to obey even when it doesn't make sense. I'm sure Ananias was scared out of his mind. I'm sure he even thought he heard God wrong. This man? God, do you know who he is? Ananias kind of reminds him, here's what he's here for. He came here to harm people like myself. And you are asking me to go directly to him, to seek him out, and to help him? This was a hard ask. But yet we see later in the story, Ananias does it. He obeys, even when it does not make sense to him. I'm sure it was hard to understand. I'm sure it was hard to believe. I'm sure it was hard to have courage. But Ananias did it. He would have never thought that this command was going to come to him. He would have had no way to anticipate it or expect it. We have things in our lives where we've maybe been asking God what our next step of obedience is, or a way that we're walking and the next step seems like a natural thing for God to ask us. This came completely out of the blue. But if we're listening and if we're paying attention, then God has the ability to speak to us out of the blue and asks us to do something even if it's difficult. Now, a word of caution here. This command coming to Ananias out of seemingly nowhere. We can have God do that for us too, but here's how we know if it's from God. Because if it really is out of the blue, if it really feels like it doesn't make sense, here's what we know to be true. God will never contradict his word, and God will never contradict his character. This out of the blue assignment is not ever going to be something that contradicts God himself. And that's how we can know if it's from him or not. So we can always go back to scripture and see, does it line up? What God asked Ananias to do was very much in line with his character. It was to provide forgiveness and help and redemption for this other person. And if you're still not sure, ask a trusted believer. Take it to someone else. If this request feels like it doesn't make any sense, but remember that God will not contradict himself. The next thing here, and this is something that isn't as evident in this story, but I think is important for us to know, is that Paul spent time learning and preparing for his calling. Now, what happens here in 9, 19, and 20, he immediately starts preaching and teaching and talking to people. And it goes on to talk about his time in Damascus and then his time in Jerusalem. And so it seems like Paul just launches into his calling full throttle. But actually what happens here, and you would never know it from reading Acts, there's a time period of about 3 years in there between Damascus and Jerusalem. And so a lot of scholars think in verse 23, where it says, after many days had gone by, they think that's referring to this 3-year gap. The only reason we know that this happened is because Paul refers to it himself. In Galatians 1, 17 and 18, it says, I did not go up to Jerusalem to see those who were apostles before I was, but I went into Arabia. Later, I returned to Damascus. Then, after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to get acquainted with Cephas and stayed with him 15 days. So even though it seems like all these things are happening in Paul's life in the span of just a few verses, really some time is passing here. And it's important for us to remember that Paul did not immediately know all the things he was supposed to teach and do. It seems that way to us. And even as we continue through Acts in these quick chapters, all of a sudden he's traveling and he's preaching and he's going on missionary journeys. But when we stop and we study, we see that there's time gaps. He spent these 15 days in Jerusalem with Peter, talking, discussing, learning, finding out what he needed to know. We don't know how he spent those 3 years, but I imagine he was preparing himself for what God had for him. Actually, there was 10 years between Paul's conversion and his first missionary journey. There was 20 years between his conversion and the first letter that he wrote that is now in our Bible. So while it seems quick and immediate to us, Paul took time to learn and to grow as a disciple. No matter what God has for us, our first job is to be learning and growing, to seeking the counsel of other wiser believers who are a step ahead of us, like he did with Peter, to take the time to learn and to grow, and then we can step into whatever it is that God has for us. The next thing is that Paul's life reflected that a change had taken place. There was this conversion, and it was evident to other people that there had been a change in his life. In 21 and 22, all those who heard him were astonished and asked, "Isn't he the man who raised havoc in Jerusalem among those who call on his name? And hasn't he come here to take them as prisoners and to the chief priests?" They're saying, "Isn't this Saul?" Because he's the same guy, but he's not the same guy. And so when we have this change in our life that Jesus produces, it should be noticeable. Now, our conversion might not be as dramatic as Paul's, but there should still be a change, even if it's slow and incremental. Even if it's not overnight, like Saul's seemed to be, there should be a noticeable change in us when we have encountered Christ. People should be able to say of me, "Isn't that Sarah, the one who fill in the blank, that I no longer do or say or believe because God has transformed me?" There should be an evident change. And it's not for our glory, it's for God's glory. Because when there's change and there's transformation, it always points back to God. When people are astonished and say, "Isn't that the one?" Because the change just does not make sense. And so we can point to God's glory when the change in our life is evident. And then finally, and this is my favorite part of this story, that no one and nothing is beyond redemption. That it would have been really easy to look at a person like Saul and say, "There's no way." And if you would have asked the believers at the time, I'm sure they would have never imagined in a million years that one, that he would convert to a Christianity, two, that he would become who he was in God's kingdom. They could have never guessed that because of who he was. But no one is beyond redemption, beyond radical transformation of Jesus' work in our life. We see at the end when he comes to Jerusalem and the disciples are afraid of him because of who he was. But Barnabas speaks up for him and they realize that he is sincere, that his is a life that's been transformed. There might be a situation in your life that you feel like is beyond hope. There might be a person that you've prayed for 4 years, or their heart is hard and you think, "There's no way." But yet we look at Paul's conversion and we see radical change is possible. That an encounter with Jesus can change everything. That no one and nothing is beyond hope. In fact, that person that you're praying for, or that coworker that you think couldn't possibly ever come to know the Lord, God might have incredible plans for that person in his kingdom. Because Paul's life not only affected the believers at the time, it affected believers for all time. His life and his story as a disciple is a gift to all of us who know Christ. So who knows? Who knows what God might have in store? Can you imagine? That person or that thing that you're praying for just might be another Paul story with a radical transformation and a redemption that is not beyond God's reach. So we have this very startling and dramatic conversion story. And yet we see there are these practical things in there that we can learn from Paul's story. We can see a redemptive God at work who has his eyes on his people and on his church and was working in ways that no one could see. We have people who are Obedient, willing disciples, even when it is scary. Poor Ananias, even when it is hard and doesn't make sense. We see these ordinary humans, sinful like Saul, doubtful like Ananias, fearful like the disciples in Jerusalem, courageous like Barnabas, who step into what God has, who are willing to listen, respond to God's call, and obey. They press the gospel forward. We too can remember these principles, obey God, press the gospel forward, and it's all for God's glory. Only He can work these miracles in me and in you and in the world around us. Only He can write a story like this, one that we could never dream. So let's willingly participate and play the role that God has for us. And who knows, you might be praying for the next kingdom changer. God bless you.